Welcome to The Point. I'm Marcel Wieder, coming to you from the Peach Gallery in downtown Toronto. It's election time again in Ontario, with municipal elections set for October 27th. We'll discuss how the campaign is unfolding and what races to watch in this edition of The Point. The Ontario Election Marathon began on January 2nd, when nominations opened up across the province for the close to 2,800 council and nearly 800 trustee positions available. Some campaigns have been sedate affairs, where the winners have already been preordained, while others have been raucous events. We have a panel of experts joining us to provide insight into what's happening in the campaigns across Ontario as we head into the final weeks. Recently, the headlines have been focused on Toronto, where Mayor Rob Ford has dropped out of the race due to health concerns. However, while all eyes are fixated on Toronto, other regions across Ontario are in flux. In Mississauga, the battle to replace Hurricane Hazel is being waged. 93-year-old Mississauga Mayor Hazel McCallion, the longest-serving mayor in Canadian history, has announced that after 36 years at the helm, she is retiring. In London, Ontario, candidates seek to regain voter confidence after the resignation of Mayor Joe Fontana. The former mayor was convicted on 3 criminal charges related to a $1,700 expense he charged to taxpayers while serving as a Liberal MP. And in Hamilton, former Mayor Fred Eisenberger has his name on the ballot, as the current mayor, Bob Bertina, is not running for re-election. Today, we are joined by Andy Radia, John Mykytyshyn, and Sheila White on this edition of The Point. Andy Radia is political columnist with Yahoo Canada. Andy, appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
It's Ontario election time. The 27th is polling day. What's the general mood in the province from what you've been able to discern?
You know, one thing that's striking for me is I just moved out here from British Columbia, as you know, earlier this year. People are passionate about municipal politics here. People are going to the all candidates meetings. People are talking about it. I think people are into it. People are paying attention to what's going on, and I think that's a good thing.
Well, historically, we've only seen about 35% voter turnout for municipal elections. Almost half of what we get in federal and just slightly less than provincial elections. Do you expect that there's going to be more people coming out to this election?
I think so, but 35% compared to what we see in the big cities in Vancouver, we're looking at anywhere between 21 and 25% to be the average. So I know 35% isn't great, but it's not bad compared to British Columbia. I think we will this time around. There's some mayors who've been around for a long time stepping down. Again, I think people are interested. So I think voter turnout might sneak up to the low to mid 40s this time around.
That'll be interesting to see that. Speaking of mayors who are stepping down, we see that Mayor McCallion in Mississauga has stepped down. We have in London with Joe Fontana, who was kind of forced to step down after being convicted on several charges. The Mayor of Windsor, Eddie Francis, is stepping down. And of course, we have the big race here in the city of Toronto with Rob Ford stepping down and his brother coming in. Yeah. What do you get a sense of from all of this changes? What are people telling you out on the streets?
I think, for municipal elections, the big issue, the big thing is name recognition. So I think we've got some former mayors running in Hamilton and I believe in Windsor. Mm-hmm. So that helps those people. Name recognition is key in the Toronto election. The Ford Nation, they've got their name out there. People know who they are. I think that's going to be a key. Mm-hmm. And then we talk about the issues that these candidates are focusing on. Throughout the GTA, throughout Ontario, we're looking at, infrastructure, taxes, and probably the biggest one is transportation.
So let's talk about those issues.
Yeah.
Transit, taxes, infrastructure. How are they going to play out in the various races. Do you see this being the criteria by which those candidates who are going to do well will perform?
I think so. I think that's one of the key issues people are looking at in the GTA and in big cities throughout southern Ontario. Um, people are tired of waiting in their cars and sitting in traffic. So that's an issue that hits close to home. LRT is a big issue. I know they're talking about that in Mississauga. I know they're talking about that in London and Hamilton. LRT versus BRT, bus rapid transit.
And let's not forget RER, which
Yes.
is Rail Express.
Exactly. So, and then we've got in Toronto, we've got John Tory's fast track plan, and we've got the Fords talking about subways, subways, subways. So, yeah, I think that's going to be the key issue, and I think that's what people are focused on, and that's what the candidates, I think, in a lot of these races are focusing on and talking to the public about.
Mm-hmm. One kind of overshadowing issue is the scandals.
Yeah.
We had scandals in Brampton with Mayor Susan Fennell. I mentioned about what happened in London, and of course, the Ford factor here in Toronto. How do you think that's going to play out in this election?
I think when it comes to politics and maybe municipal politics, I think people have a short memory. So I think people are moving on from that. I think they want accountability, more accountability at the municipal level. And some candidates are talking about that. Candidates are talking about more, opening up expenses and to see what people are candidates or councillors or mayors are spending money on. But I think, it's a new election. And again, I think that's taking a back seat. That issue of scandals is taking a back seat to what's top of mind, which again is transit, infrastructure, and jobs.
Well, we're going to come back after the break with our additional guests, John Mykytyshyn and Sheila White. All this on The Point. We're joined by two of the best political commentators in the province. John Mykytyshyn is the president of Bradgate Research Group. He's a well-known political consultant and strategist. Also joining us is Sheila White, a former NDP candidate. She spent 13 years as a senior aide to then North York and Toronto Mayor Mel Lastman, and another 13 years as a senior advisor to the Ontario NDP party. She is the president of Words, Media and Communications, Inc. Sheila, John, thank you for joining us. So, municipal elections, 3 weeks from now. Any particular races we should be focusing in on?
I think certainly Toronto, everybody's got their eye on that, but you have London, an interesting race, Windsor, all the places where incumbents aren't running again. You're going to have a fresh new input of new blood. And so I think basically Toronto is the one to watch. And outside of the province, or outside of the city of Toronto, any place in the GTA, you've got your Hamiltons, your Kitchener-Waterloo. There's a number of exciting races.
John?
I was going to say, I think everybody wants to look outside of Toronto because it's now boring and over since John Tory apparently won a week ago. So I think that's actually interesting. I know you didn't mean it, Sheila, but I think it was a little Freudian. You mentioned Toronto and you said outside the province. Often for people outside of Toronto, it feels that way, that Toronto dominates because of the media and the focus on Toronto, that there's all these other exciting races which matter as much to the residents of those areas as the Toronto races to the citizens of Toronto. So I think it's a great year because I think those races will actually get a lot more coverage in the last 4 weeks, a lot more interest, and there's some big decisions being made across Ontario this year.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to pick up on something that Sheila just said about Toronto and then outside of the province. And the federal Conservatives have an election coming up in 2015, and they're going to be watching what happens across the province, especially in some of the 905 areas where they had good support, and now potentially places like Brampton could go Liberal in the municipal election to former Cabinet Minister Linda Jeffrey. In Mississauga, it's going to go Liberal either with Steve Mahoney or Bonnie Crombie. And so how is that going to play out for the Tories in 2015?
Well, for the feds, they're going to be looking at where they can break through in Toronto. They haven't been very successful at doing that in the longest time, since the Harris years. We saw Tim Hudak fall on his sword. So they're going to be looking at that, but they're also going to be looking at who they can cherry pick. Where are some really impressive candidates that they can maybe call into their fold, get them to think about running in 2015. Perhaps they're sitting councillors already. They can force a number of expensive by-elections, cherry pick these candidates and set themselves up, position them maybe a bit stronger.
And Andy, you've covered Ottawa, watched what the Prime Minister and the Tories have been up to. How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is one of the issues that overlaps both the federal election and the municipal election is transportation. And I know we've got all these municipal candidates talking about wanting to build these big, elaborate, LRT systems or subways. Well, that money has got to come from somewhere. And I think we'll see a bit of an overlap when we've got these candidates talking about going to the federal government for handouts for these big projects. Well, we'll see if the federal government can deliver. And I think there'll be some pressure on all the political parties to offer big transportation plans for the next election.
One of the things that we've seen in the Toronto elections is that John Tory says that he can work with both the Liberals at Queen's Park and the Tories in Ottawa to be able to deliver. And the Fords in the last election made a point of having Stephen Harper at their barbecues and the close relationship with Jim Flaherty and be able to deliver on the city. So, John, how do you see the Conservative relationship with potentially Liberal mayors and councils?
I think anybody who's thinking of making the mistake of voting for a Liberal mayor or a Liberal council should listen to exactly what you just said and not make that bad decision. That given that the Prime Minister is already announcing that there should be goodies with a surplus budget, that they'll be looking at ways on the eve of an election of doling out some of that money. And if I had a choice between a Conservative or a right-minded or a fiscal small c Conservative option, whether the people are partisan or not, I would think that would be a way better idea than any version of a Liberal, because I don't think the Prime Minister would be looking at using money to go to Liberal mayors to bolster them and their friends. I think you'll see him do the prudent thing and support people that support him.
So just picking up on that, in your hometown of Hamilton, Brad Clark, a former Harris MPP, is running for mayor against the past mayor Eisenberger. And how's that playing out?
Well, it's actually interesting because most mayors in Ontario now are Liberals or Liberal affiliated. There's very few Conservatives or even small c Conservatives in those offices. Brad has now been on council a couple terms, so he's certainly part of the local environs. He's not fresh to the scene, but I think I think that's not really an issue there for him. It's not so much his political pedigree, other than he's the only one of the candidates who sat around a cabinet table, who's been in the higher levels of government, so he would be well placed to have those kind of conversations with the federal or provincial government. So I don't think the partisanship matters as much in his situation, although it might. The reality is Brad will do well because he's the best candidate.
Mm-hmm. And Sheila, we talked about Toronto and Olivia Chow. A lot of people had high hopes for her coming into the election. And in fact, the early polls had her significantly ahead of both Rob Ford at the time and John Tory. Now we've seen almost inverse. John Tory has doubled her and is seeming to gain even more momentum. What really has happened with that campaign?
Well, the campaign isn't over yet, so we can't just take a snapshot of a single poll and say, the winner shall be declared today as we're having this conversation. Olivia needs to get out there with her game plan and attract the body of volunteers needed to get her message out. There's no denying that she's an extremely accomplished and credible candidate. And I would say she has the best plan for transit when we're talking about transit in Toronto. Hers actually stays within the budget envelope. It's not pie in the sky. It can be done now. So she needs to do a better job of communicating her plan and at the same time taking on the so-called Smart Track program of John Tory, which is full of holes. But she needs to exploit the weaknesses in his
So-
campaign.
So you think she's a credible choice with a good plan?
I do.
The reason I'm asking is a couple weeks ago, I looked at the websites for the first time. Like most people, I look at these races later because I want to make sure that the websites are fully developed. And I was shocked at her website above all the other candidates that I didn't get that sense of clear communication and focus. So if there's a good plan in there, I didn't frankly stay long enough to find out. I was doing what most people do, is maybe 15 minutes on a website, and I went to all of them. And clear, we know what John Tory's about. More this, more that, more the other thing. But at least he's saying more. So he's coming from a place. And I was actually very surprised that Olivia, given all the people around her, had such a failure of communication.
And I would agree with you that communication is Olivia's largest challenge now. She has a lot to say. She has a good platform. We need to hear more about it, and we need to hear about the holes in the other platform that I think people are taking seriously, which is John Tory's. Take a look at Smart Track. Where are the presidents of the CN and CP Rail standing alongside Mr. Tory to even tell us that this is possible? Sharing federal rail lines is no simple matter. There's all kinds of regulations, including the sounding of train horns at the early morning. So when you get that passenger train, thanks to John Tory, and you have a 6 a.m. train horn blowing 3 times in your ear, we might think differently, but we have to look at the details. The devil isn't in the details. And Olivia needs to sharpen her focus and her communication skills to get these messages out.
Andy, I'm going to come back to you on the federal impact of 2 by-elections that took place in Toronto. And you've written on both of those, where the Liberals won in Toronto Centre, and then they picked up in the adjoining riding next over.
In Trinity Spadina.
Trinity Spadina, thank you. So those 2 by-elections went Liberal. One was a hold against a very strong NDP challenger. The second one was a takeaway by a former city councillor, Adam Vaughan. And so is that a harbinger of things for the Chow campaign, possibly?
It could be. I don't think it helps the Chow campaign. I think it shows that there's a trend towards the right, or at least towards the middle in Toronto Centre. And I think that's definitely of concern, or should be of concern, to Olivia Chow's team and progressive voters in downtown Toronto.
We also saw, and I'll open this to the panel, in the provincial election, the Liberals took away 3 NDP seats in the old city of Toronto. And that seems to have had an impact in terms of where Toronto voters seem to be headed. How is Chow?
Do you think it really was that, or do you think it was the parties crossed in the last provincial? Because for my money, the Liberals were further to the left of the other parties, and the NDP made a concerted effort to move to the right, and I think they passed each other. So I think who got elected as representative, the city is still the city and still representative of what it's a representative of. It's the parties that passed and confused everybody.
I'll let my friend Sheila chime in on this.
Well, the outcome of that provincial was clearly bad timing. There was not supposed to be an election. It should have been next year, and the opposition parties needed to have used that time to get their platforms together, craft a cogent message, and excite people about the prospect of having them back in Parliament. My biggest regret on that whole election was how the NDP threw away its balance of power. It had some heft and some weight and could influence policy. And now for the next 4 years, they're basically a rump.
So I'm going to pick up on something Andy said just a little while ago, and that is the top issues in the municipal election seem to be focused on transit, infrastructure, and taxes. Fair? Or is it something else?
No, absolutely, that's it.
And what's the sense of voters in terms of how they approach those issues? Are they in favor of more transit, keeping the same, giving it to public versus the car, or is it which is that dynamic? Because I know the Fords in the last campaign talked about protecting motorists against the attacks on drivers.
Yeah, the war on the cars.
The war on the cars. Thank you.
Well, I have very strong opinions about this because what Mr. Ford did was kill the fantastic LRT line we would have had. I live very close to the site, so and none of the candidates who are talking about transit along Shepherd or anywhere in the Scarborough area actually live anywhere close to there. And I've got to tell you, I was just driving Shepherd yesterday. You can fire a cannon down that road at most times of the day. It is not a place for a subway. The plan that Rob Ford killed in 2010, which was approved by council, would have reduced the bus use, would have got the buses off the road. It was a wonderful train that would take it right out to the eastern border of Pickering where transit is needed. We're not going to get that with a subway. And it was just a wonderful plan that would create bike lanes so that cars, transit, and bikes could safely share roadways.
And outside of Toronto, transit's a big issue, right? So look at Ottawa, look at Hamilton, look at the Waterloo region where the regional council has passed and adopted and has a plan for a brand new LRT, but it was done under the cloak of secrecy, closed door meetings. The documents aren't all public. There was a very vociferous Stop the LRT campaign last year, and usually politicians get away with this stuff. And if you look at that region, both at the city and regional level, there's a phenomenal number of turnovers in a number of politicians that are retiring this year who had one position and then they were against it originally, voted another way, and then have decided to retire rather than face the electorate, because there's still so many questions around the funding. You can't fund a 30-year project with very many guarantees. So transit in all these regions it seems to be bubbling to the top as the number one issue. While taxes and the backdrop of the economy and development, all of those are there, and it's all intricately woven. The reality is, how do you pay for a mega project? And as we've just found out with the Pan Am Games, every update means another bigger missed deadline, a bigger debt, and there's never been a government project that met a timeline or a financial deadline.
Well, we're going to save the Pan Am Games for another show.
Sure.
But, you raised a couple of good points. We got a year till the Pan Am Games.
It might take you that long to drive here.
And Marcel, don't you find it ironic that Rob Ford wanted to make it better for drivers? He killed the one transit plan that was going to lead to less congestion. And now the war on the car, it's definitely on, because you can't go anywhere in this city thanks to Rob Ford.
Well, you got the last word in. I want to thank our guests, Andy Radia, John Mykytyshyn, and Sheila White, who are here on The Point. Join us in 2 weeks, October 20th, as we tee up the final sprint to the finish in the municipal elections. We'll also take a look at the upcoming Ontario legislative session, and we go to the Canadian News Hall of Fame Awards, where Toronto Star publisher John Hondrick and CTV's Ottawa Bureau Chief Greg Oliver will be honored. Until next time, I'm Marcel Wieder from The Point at the Peach Gallery.